Hello guys and welcome back. And this is chapter 6 of our production pipelines tutorial. Alright, and we left off with the UDIM workflows. So I showed you how to use Arnold's UDIM token to take the hair and kind of sort of texture it in a much easier way with the multi-tile workflow. So that's very great for using Mari or Mudbox or a different painting app of sorts that allows you to do multi-tile painting. So in this one, what we're going to do is we're going to go over a little bit of what I did to finish up some of the textures, and we're going to go over Arnold's texture manager, which is going to allow us to easily convert our textures into a format that allows Arnold to render at its very best. So if we go ahead and hit the IPR and get that running here, and let that go ahead and export out our scene and kick in a little bit. We'll see that she's fully textured. And some of the areas that we're going to want to concentrate a little bit on are going to be areas like the mouth that required a little bit of special care. So the tongue, which I have here, in Daz characters, the tongue and the teeth come as a material that's the same for both. I separated the two because the teeth need a little bit more of a specular to them. They need to be a little bit more shiny, a little bit more metallic, as they're made out of calcium. So I separated that material out into its own shader network, and I came in here and I basically added a little bit of extra specular to the object here, gave it a pretty high specular weight and gave it a very low roughness to make it a little bit more metallic. I also added a little bit of reflectance to normal, and what that does is it brings in the Fresnel a little bit more. So instead of it being more of a glancing type of reflection, more of the reflectivity starts to reflect in the whole entire object. And then of course we have a bump map for the teeth as well. The tongue is pretty similar, except specular is a lot more rough for this, so it's a more diffuse material. But this material also has subsurface scattering, and I've increased the radius of the red so that a lot more of the red shines through. And I might actually make this about 5 so that a lot more of the red will come through in the shader, in the standard shader. Alright, so that takes care of that. For the eyes, I separated the materials out a little bit as well for those. So we have the, let's see if I can find it. So we have the sclera material, and the sclera is the white of the eye. It's a shiny part of the eye. So for that, we kind of sort of want a little bit more of a specular and probably even a little bit more reflectance than normal. So I'm going to go ahead and up this a little bit just to bring in the reflectance a little bit more. Fresnel, and you know, a moderate weight to it and not too shiny. We don't want it to be metal, but we do want to have like a sort of kind of clear coat on the specular to reflect some of the environment. The pupil and the iris, I separated those out so that I could actually bring their specular down a little bit. They don't need to be as bright, so I'm going to bring that down just a little bit. And they don't really need quite as much roughness, somewhere in about half for them. They don't need to be nearly as shiny. They're more of a matte kind of sort of deal. It's mainly the sclera that has a lot of shininess, and of course the cornea itself. The cornea is an intriguing one. If we go over to my browser here, and we go ahead and pull up under my tutorials and info here, I have a CG Talk thread saved here. You can pause the video and look at that link, but this thread has a really nice IOR list in it, and so all I did was I hit Control F and I typed in cornea, and that gave me the IOR for cornea. So once again, Arnold is a physically accurate renderer, and it uses the IORs just like Maxwell to allow you to do some really accurate implementations of your materials. So we open up the network editor and we come here to our refraction. We're able to, not for the pupil, but for the cornea, let's go ahead and find that material here. So for the cornea, we're able to go ahead and set our IOR on our refraction to 1.38, and we go ahead and set our refraction all the way up to 1. I've also set the diffuse for this material all the way down to 0, so there's no diffuse color in this shader. It's primarily just refraction and some specular. Specular is giving it its reflection, allowing it to reflect the environment. And this would be a good case for perhaps using the AL surface as well. So the great thing is we could switch between these two. So the great thing about Arnold is if we just want to use another output, we certainly can just plug it into the beauty port and use a different one. So depending upon, which one we find we like better, we can just go ahead and play and test. So coming in here, we've got, a specular 1 and a specular 2, and all the other usual controls. You got your diffuse, which we'd probably set down to 0. We've got a specular strength, which could probably bring down a little bit. Another specular strength that we could bring up and then bring down the roughness a little bit there. We can play around with the IOR. The IOR of cornea is 1.38. Play around with the reflectivity and kind of get an idea of what we want to kind of sort of do with this material. Let's see. Alright, so let's just plug this material in and see if it's giving us what we want here. And so we are getting, appears to be some kind of refraction. Not really quite what we're looking for, but we could play around with that and kind of sort of get an idea of what we want. I'm going to stick with the standard shader for now. We might come back to that. But the AL standard shader will give you a lot more control over the specular, so you can get much tighter spotlights and stuff like that. Get more of a kind of sort of clear coat look there. All right. So that was most of the weird ones. Once again, the fingernails, I separated those out into their own material, and I gave them a lot more specular than the original limbs material. They also don't need subsurface scattering, so I could probably go ahead and bring that down and delete that port actually. Their specular should be a little bit higher. Okay, so I just kind of duplicated the material, but I didn't really actually implement any of the changes to it. A little bit more reflectance at normal. It's going to make them a little bit more reflective, and everything else pretty much stays the same as the limbs. And that'll just make those a little bit more shiny than the rest of the limb material. And it'll give the nails their characteristic metal-esque sheen, their shiny sheen. Alright, so with all that done, if we come over here to test this folder here, and we look at our textures, so we come in here to the master, come into C4D, and come into our textures here. Our textures right now are JPEGs, and frankly, Arnold really doesn't like JPEGs. The reason why Arnold is the darling of the Hollywood industry is in the way that it calculates things. It calculates things extremely fast. There's some really tight code in there as far as the mathematics behind how it calculates out light. And part of the reason why it's able to do that so fast in certain situations is because of its texture format. Arnold uses a image library that has a specific texture format that allows Arnold's calculations to be incredibly fast. So what Arnold is able to do is, if you're using its custom texture format, it's able to load only very specific parts of the texture. So if you're dealing with a movie like District, I believe it's District 9, I think is what the movie was called, or you're dealing with a movie like Aliens, or a movie like Terminator Salvation or something like that, where you've got these really close-up shots of like these robots or these alien creatures, or Transformers, and you're dealing with these really, really detailed textures. These guys like to use 8K textures in the movies to get like this really, really tight detail on their characters. And not all the time will you see the whole entire character on the screen at once. So in order for Arnold to be able to like use memory more efficiently and use less of it, it breaks the textures apart into tiles in memory, and it's able to find out that, you know, only one particular part of this texture needs to be loaded up and used at any given time, and it saves it on memory, and it also makes it just that much slightly more faster. So in C4D to A, we're able to use the texture manager here built into C4D to A to convert any textures we want from this crappy JPEG format into the TX format. And what we can do is we can hit create here, and it'll go ahead and every single texture that we have selected, it will go ahead and convert them into the format that we need. So we can come in here and do a shift click and select everything, or we can come over here and do a select all, and we can go ahead and do a create, and that'll go ahead and run through, and it'll use the command line make text program, which is located in your C4D 2A installation, and it'll go ahead and it'll run that for you and create all the textures for you. So we'll come back once all the textures have been created. So we're back, and I've got my Windows Explorer window open here. And so all the textures were created, and you can see here in the texture manager, you've got this little parentheses TX here, which means that the original textures are still in the scene. And in fact, if we go to one of our materials, we'll see that in fact it's still named JPEG, but Arnold recognizes that there's a TX version next to that JPEG, and so it will use the TX version to render instead of using the JPEG version, and you'll get a slightly more optimized and slightly faster render that way. I personally don't like to work that way. What I like to do is I like to actually get rid of all the original textures and just leave the text versions here. Mostly because if you're transferring this to a render farm, or like I'm dealing with a client in Europe, and I want to transfer my files over to his big powerful machine in order to render out data. And so I don't want to really deal with having to transfer over multiple gigs of data. I want to transfer just what I need to transfer, get it out of the way, and be able to get it rendered. If you're in a place where you've got more of a bandwidth limit, then it's even more imperative for you to minimize what you're transferring over the internet. So what we can do is we can go ahead and create a new folder really quickly just to hold all of our TXs. And what we can do is we can type in TX here in Windows Explorer, grab all the TXs, and then we can come over here and just move all the TXs into a separate folder. And so they'll all be moved. Then what we can do is we can take all of our original textures, and we can go ahead and actually move all the original textures over to a new folder. So that folder, I like to, under my master asset, I like to call that original textures. And in this folder, I can store all my original textures. And what I can do is, if I need to make an edit or a change to my original texture, I can go ahead and I can make that change. And then I can run Arnold's texture manager again and just go ahead and convert that back into a TX. and I've got an update. So that's really great. So we can take all the original textures now, and we can go ahead and move those over to our original textures folder. Now in Arnold itself, we're going to want to go ahead and stop the render, and we're going to want to go ahead and flush the caches, just to make sure that nothing is locked down for Windows. So we'll come back over here, and everything should have cleared out. Then we can just take the TXs and go ahead and move those back into the TX folder and get rid of the new folder. It was just a temporary folder we were using to get the TXs out of the way. And there we go. Now, the only problem we face here, of course, is that all of our shaders are basically, or all of our materials are basically missing now. They're all named JPEG in our shaders, but they're not named TX like they should be. So what's going to happen in Arnold here is they're going to actually pop up red, and you're going to see just a big red scene here for missing images. Actually, you would see that, but because we're using UDIMs on one of the textures, it actually just plain out failed to render anything. But you'll notice here on your material previews that you're seeing red, which means there's some images missing in some of your shaders. So what we can do is we can come in here and select everything, and we can go ahead and replace .jpeg with .tx. And so this is a feature that actually, when we were doing the beta test, we actually asked them to do, and they quickly implemented it for us, which is really amazing. Kudos to the Solid Angle team and to the developers there. And so we can replace all the JPEG symbols with TX really quickly in our shaders. And so everything will now be found. And we can see now that we have hard brackets instead of those little curly brackets, which means that it's recognizing that these are actually truly TX. So if we were to hit, if we were to stop this and then hit play again, everything should be the exact same. Only difference now is that we're using Arnold's texture format, and everything should be a lot better. Let's go ahead and see why our render is failing here. Valid image file, backlight, HDRI. Okay, so it's just that the sky dome light doesn't it didn't automatically change the sky dome light to a different file. So that's easy enough. We'll go ahead and change that, and now everything should render. And there we go. Beautiful. So that's a overview of the optimization process for Arnold. It's one of the last things you're going to want to do. I guess you could do it at the start, but you probably want to do it after you've shaded everything and just made sure that all the images are okay. And then, you know, as you go back into Mari, or you go back into Body Paint or ZBrush or Mudbox and you edit different things, you can always come in here, come into the texture manager, and just, you know, convert your textures over again. But alrighty, so now we've pretty much completed her scene and she's ready to animate, she's ready to be used, but we don't want to necessarily use this file specifically to actually animate her scene. Once again, like I mentioned in my my advanced exporting integration tutorial series, we want to let this file stay as a master so that we can always come back to it, make changes to it, and we can use it as the main file for other shots. You know, if we have 10, 15, 25 shots where this character is going to be in, we want to make sure that one file is the master and that we can use it to update all the others. And we don't want to mess up our master. So let's go ahead and close her mouth here real quick. We're going to come into our pose morphs here. and use the scroll bar here. Go ahead and close her up. Go ahead and save her. Go ahead and turn off the Arnold render so we don't have to worry about it wigging out when we change scenes around. And what we want to do now is we want to come in and we want to go ahead and just basically copy all her textures. I'm currently working on a database system of sorts that's going to allow me to basically have a much tighter XREF workflow. I will of course let you guys know when that is finished and developed. It'll be a server system that'll basically allow you to have one master file instead of having to do this copy and paste and have like 50 billion files in different folders. But for now, this is kind of the way we need to do it because the XREFs don't really work all that well in Arnold, and the XREF workflow in C4D is a little messy even as is, even in its basic form. So instead, what we can do is we can create a new scene, and I've created a new scene called Arnold Landscape here, where we're going to go over some ZBrush stuff, and I'm going to show you how to do some sub-polygon displacement in the next tutorial using Arnold, and show you how to use some more multi-tile workflow stuff. But what we can come in here and do is we can go ahead and create a new folder, and we can call it Testa2. And because it's in the text folder, Cinema 4D's default texture folder, Arnold will be able to find these textures just fine. So we'll copy those over because we need those in order to be able to see Testa correctly. And then we'll go back to her master and we'll go ahead and copy, well, we're actually done. All we need to do is just copy the textures to that folder. And so this will be our shot. So for every new shot or for every new scene, you basically want to create a separate folder, to keep your shots separated from your master assets. And if this landscape were a master city asset, you'd probably want to keep it in a separate folder as well, and then bring it into whatever your shot is going to be called. So it's just a really good way to organize things. A good way to keep your master assets from not getting messed up. If you do something wrong to an asset in your shot, you can always go back to your master and re-import it in and get everything back right. So we're going to load up the Arnold landscape, and I just created this really quick between lessons. It's just a simple scene here with a somewhat of a road of sorts and two landscapes. And so what we're going to do is we're going to go into ZBrush and we're going to make these look really, really, really nice. And we're going to use some Arnold shaders, some advanced Arnold shader networks to go ahead and get these to look really, really good. But what we want to do is we want to bring in Testa here. So we can go ahead and merge her in. And we can go over to Testa2, go over to her master asset, and load up the Arnold asset. And we know that this is our master asset because we named it correctly, and we know that that's good to go. And so she's loaded in. And what's really great is all her materials have also loaded in as well. Also, our scene has its own materials as well, and I've been really good about going ahead and actually naming those materials and making sure that those materials were in their own separate kind of sort of deal as well. So, now we have Testa separated and we have the scene material separated. And that's the reason why I kind of went over that workflow earlier about making sure everything has its own layers. All right. And so Testa is also in her own group as well, so she's nice and clean. I could have cleaned her up a little bit better so that everything would be in one nice spot, but let's go ahead and take the lantern and all this and do an Alt-G to go ahead and group those together, and we'll call this landscape. I like to have my Arnold skies up at the top, my cameras and all my default objects kind of sort of up at the top. T-pose bones, we can go ahead and get rid of those too. We don't need those. And we kind of need her poses, so I'm going to go ahead and push those into her folder. And now our scene is very, very clean. All right, so let's take a look at this scene and see what we're dealing with here. All right, so first of all, our resolution is not right. So let's go into our Arnold settings and take care of some of our resolution issues here. Let's start with our resolution. Let's make that 720p. Our frame rate, we're going to go with film at 24. We're going to hit Control D to go into our project settings here, and we're going to set the FPS to also be 24 here as well, so it matches the render settings. That way we don't get any oddball frame rate changes. Project scale and all that is fine, and we're getting a really bright red scene here, and that's because we're missing a texture of some sort. So let's look at our Arnold sky, and it looks like the HDRI is missing for this Arnold sky, and so that's going to put us back to a normal spot. So let's go ahead and grab an HDRI real quick to give us a better kind of sort of look. And so I picked out from my graphics and designs assets library that I have on my server this dusk sun. It looked pretty interesting. So let's go ahead and drag that into the Arnold sky here. And that's going to go ahead and refresh. And let's check exactly what the resolution of this is. So yeah, it's going to load up that HDRI, which is a 32-bit format, so it's going to take a little bit of time. And you can see we have a huge amount of radiance here available to us. So much so that right now it's blown out in the current view. Our biggest resolution is 7070, so that's what we're going to want to use in our Arnold sky. So let's come back here to our light, and let's make this 7070. Now, for our background, let's go ahead and reduce the intensity considerably. Let's also take the sky dome light and decrease the exposure as well, down to a standard 1. Alrighty, so I did a few changes. Arnold only took like maybe 5-10 seconds to go ahead and update, but you know, just to speed things along here, I spared you guys a little bit of the update process for it. But yeah, we could probably bring down the intensity ever so slightly more. Actually, I'm looking for more of a dim scene, honestly, in this one, because I'm going to show off these mesh lights that we've got in the scene here. Alright, and let that kick in and refresh a little bit. Alright, so we're getting a more dimmer scene here. I think I'm going to go with 0.05 for the intensity of the actual background itself. And that's just going to really dull down our Arnold sky. Give us some nice global illumination, but really dull down the scene. So she looks like she's walking on more of a dusty road. Alright. And then looking at our tiki light here that I've included in the scene. This little stone lantern. We're going to go into world movement mode, and we're going to go ahead and just move this over and move it this way. And let's just take a look at some of the texturing that's gone into this light. So this light's from another scene that I've been working on, but it's got a few textures to it. So really just a diffuse and a emissive texture. So the emissive texture is just the brightness of these particular glowing little glyphs or symbols here. And so if we were to turn off our quad lights. So we have quad lights here, and they've got yellow kind of sort of color to them, and with a little bit of intensity and whatnot. But if we turn off each of these lights, what we'll be left with is just the emissive color of the glyphs. We'll let that kick in. Alrighty. So if we were to, say, bring a sphere into our scene here, and we were to kind of place it a little bit closer to the lantern, we'll notice that the sphere should be getting a little bit of light cast onto it from the lantern itself. And yes, it's getting a little bit. So the way this material is set up, if we go into our scene materials and we go to the light, you see that we have a image for the diffuse, and we have a image for the emission, which is a TIFF file. And actually, interestingly enough, the TIFF and EXR formats are tileable, so they're a good format to use with Arnold. I would personally convert everything into TX towards the end of whatever scene you're working on, just to get just that much more speed. But Arnold likes EXRs and TIFFs. It hates JPEGs. It doesn't like PNGs. It doesn't like any of those kind of sort of more web-friendly formats. Those two kind of more professional formats, TIFF and EXR, are the ones that it really likes. And then, of course, it has its own format that's its best format, the TX. Interestingly enough, if you need to work on a TX for whatever reason, just really quickly, TX and TIFF actually do happen to be the same format. When you rename the TX to TIFF, it actually will load up in Photoshop and you can edit it. So it's kind of a nice thing to know. But under the standard material here, we have an emission scale. And if you have an emissive color plugged into the emission, the scale will make the emissive texture brighter or not so bright. So as we turn this down, we'll see that the light gets, the sphere gets less and less light. And as we turn this up, the sphere will get more and more light. So excellent. Now, the interesting thing in Arnold is emission happens to be one of the, it's a nice way to kind of sort of work, and it has its good and bad times when you want to use it. However, if you're doing like a significant amount of mesh lighting where your geometry is going to cast lights, you may want to use a mesh light, as mesh lights will give you less noise. Emission textures require a lot of AAs to get rid of their noise. Especially if you're using emissive lights primarily to render your scene. If you're using if you have to have a lot of emissive sources, then emission textures are probably not going to be the best bet for you, because you're going to have extremely long render times as you have to bump up the settings to get rid of a lot of that noise. Hence the reason why I used mesh lights here. They're much, much, much faster. However, we could take this sphere and we could add a Arnold mesh light tag to it. And if we do that, what will end up happening is the sphere will become a light source in and of itself. And this is an extremely good way to light something like a light on a ship, or maybe a light hula hoop, or something that's uniquely shaped that needs to be emissive, perhaps a fluorescent light bulb. This is a great way to light that kind of sort of thing. And in fact, you can actually turn on the visibility of the light so that the light actually is also visible in the scene. So It's a really great way, and it produces a lot less noise for samples than the emissive textures do. So those are two ways you can light your scene using luminant type materials. This stuff is similar, the emissive texture is similar to the way Arnold's luminance channel works, or C4D's luminance channel works. So that's how you get your luminance in your scene. That being said, I kind of want to try something. Let's see if we can increase the emission past 1 here and get a much brighter. Okay, yeah, so we can get a significantly brighter tiki torch here at the cost of fireflies and a lot more noise. And if we were to reduce our intensity even more on our sky, we'll start to get her illuminated purely by the tiki torch. So let's let that kick in and refresh itself. Cool. And so we can get a lot more light from that tiki torch. But we're going to get a lot more noise and a lot more weird highlights out of that. So that's probably not going to be the best solution for us in this particular case. And most of the time, emissive surfaces really aren't the best solution. They're really great for really small things where you just need to kind of sort of visually get some oomph into your scene a little bit. So having it at about like 1 is pretty good. I'm going to get just a little bit of lighting on that thing. But what I really want to do is turn back on these lanterns and let those kick in. And then I just want to go ahead and maybe adjust their color. Choose a screen color and choose something like that kind of sort of pink that I got going on there. And just adjust their color so that they match the color of the scene that I'm working on. And actually, as it turns out, these lights are actually being driven by an espresso system. So I actually happen to have some espresso on here that's allowing me to control the light color for all the lights. So that's another thing about Arnold that's really great. It works with the espresso. I'm able to drive Arnold parameters with that. This espresso system is pretty simple. I'm just driving the Arnold light exposures and colors off of this one user data area that I've added to the stone lantern, and that's just allowing me to manage all their exposures and all their light, all their color in one spot, which is allowing me to just help that emissive, get more light into the scene, and it gives me a lot more control over what's going on with that. So in the next lesson, we're going to go ahead and continue working on this scene here. Eventually, we're going to get her walking using the Lumiere Rig tools and some motion capture directly here in Cinema. But we're also going to clone these tiki lights across here, show off some of the cloner feature, some of the fact that Arnold works really well with cloners. And we'll go ahead and use GoZ to do some really interesting stuff between Cinema, ZBrush, and Maya to get this stuff textured and get some really nice UVs. So we'll be looking at all of that in the next lesson. See you guys then.